Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, dear friends, it is an honor and an excitement to welcome you all to today's event titled Practical Tools for Addressing Weapons Diversion, convened by the Stimson Center jointly with the Small Arms Survey, Conflict Armaments Research, and the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. This event is generously supported by the Government of Ireland. My name is Himayu Shiotani. I am the head of Conventional Arms Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. And once again, it is a pleasure to welcome all of you to this morning's or this afternoon's event. The objective of this event is to actually look into facilitating an expert dialogue and generating ideas and knowledge on practical ways that states and the national governments can take to prevent and reduce the risk of diversion. We're coming together at this time because the event itself is timely. It's timely because there is an upcoming working group and preparatory session under the Armstroy Treaty in preparation for its 7th Conference of State Parties under the presidency of the Sierra Leonean government. It is also timely to look at the issue of weapons diversion, as this issue will also be explored further under the program, a UN Program of Action on Small Arms, for its 7th biannual meeting of state parties that will be looking at the topic of diversion. So in this regard, we want to take the opportunity to bring experts together to look at practical ways and to explore ways in really reducing, mitigating, and preventing the risk of these diversion aspects. Now, this event and the expert panel, as noted from Stimson Center, Small Arms Survey, Conflict Armaments Research, with the introduction of Government of Ireland, will really look at bottom-up approach, but also top-down approach. What I mean by this is that we will look at in-country experiences as to how diversion risks have been addressed or reduced, but also look at to draw from multi-year studies that have been done by the Stimson Center as well as Small Arms Survey in framing the issue of what is meant by diversion and how do one detect the risk of diversion, how do you mitigate it, and in fact, how do you respond to it? These are all quite unique elements that need to be considered. I'm also very pleased to share upfront that this panel is formative of a partnership that is currently being undertaken to understand the impact of the Armstroy Treaty in reducing and mitigating the risk of diversion, which is also supported by the governments of France and Germany. So with this very brief introduction, before getting started into the substantive part, I also want to cover a little bit of housekeeping issues. So first and foremost, this is a Zoom webinar. It's secure, but of course, we are mindful that in online events, disruptions may be possible. So in this regard, we have a good support team from the Stimson Center, with sincere thanks to them. And in case that disruption does take place, they're very well prepared to issue guidance to the participants as to how we might reconnect. Second, since this is a webinar session, the video function and the audio function is made available to the panel speakers. The participants do not have this function. However, we are looking for interactiveness. So in this regard, you have a question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom function, where you can pose questions to the panelists on anything that you would like on this topic throughout the event. I encourage you to post questions as they come to your mind, and not to wait until the end to post them, so that we can take into account those questions as we enter into the discussion phase. Of course, we are also mindful of time. So I take this opportunity to remind our panel speakers, please do keep aligned to the allocated time so that we can have sufficient time for discussions at the end. I also want to acknowledge upfront that not all questions or comments that come from the panel, as well as from the floor, may be addressed due to time constraints. In this regard, if you are very interested in engaging with the speakers, please don't be shy to indicate that. And I'm sure that the panel speakers themselves will be available for bilateral discussions subsequent to this event. And finally, for everybody's awareness, this event is live and it's being recorded. So after this event is over, it will become publicly available. All right, with that housekeeping out of the way, allow me, please, as a moderator, to just set the scene very, very quickly. First, the issue of armed violence. The armed violence is estimated to claim over 500,000 lives each year. And within this context, poorly regulated arms, illicit arms, or diverted arms and their misuse is a huge contributing factor to this, let's say, harm and the subsequent longer-term impact that it has on societies. In particular, we look at the issue of diversion as a critical component in this dialogue, because as one may imagine, most of these items come from the licit sphere, where there's a chain breaking in the supply chain, which ends up into the illicit market or wrongful, unauthorized end uses. So in fact, our understanding, to set the scene really, is that diversion is at the heart of addressing illicit proliferation, but also preventing misuse that could be contributing to violations of human rights, international humanitarian law, or other serious organized crime. Second message I want to mention is that it is also that when diversion does happen, it is important that we take a holistic approach to this topic. The speakers will elaborate further on this, but diversion can take place in multiple forms and throughout the supply chain of the weapon. And this can happen in the transfer chain itself, but also after the delivery of a transfer down the supply chain. And what we find in research so far is that states that are often affected by these type of, let's say, armed violence or conflict are disproportionately affected and at risk of diversion. And this is a critical point of a departure for the dialogue today, because one can imagine to put in place effective national control systems to manage and regulate arms. But where diversion points may take place throughout the supply chain, that is the point in which your control measures could become vulnerable. And so this is why we believe that it is essential that one takes a holistic approach to this topic, and that we are able to connect the expertise and the roles and responsibilities that may fall in the supply side of controls, that may fall within the stockpile management of these controls, but also how one takes care of end use and diversion monitoring. And I'm sure our panel speakers will cover this in detail. So with that very brief scene setter, it's really an excitement for me to welcome, first and foremost, an introductory remark from Emma Tobin, the lead of Conventional Weapons and Arms Trade Treaty in the Disarmament and Non-Proliferation section in the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. And please, Emma, please allow me to thank on behalf of the panel, but also the Stimson Center for the gracious support that you have provided to us in this forum. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Hima. Let me just get my camera set up. There we go. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to introduce today's discussion and the launch of Stimson's new paper on diversion and the Arms Trade Treaty, which has been Ireland's absolute pleasure to support. I'm going to keep my remarks brief as we have an excellent panel lined up, but at the risk of repeating Hima's excellent overview, I do want to open by reminding of the context in which we are having this discussion and why Ireland continues to support these projects. The diversion and trade in illicit arms is a key contributing factor to conflict, instability, and insecurity, as Hima has outlined. Half of all violent deaths involve small arms and light weapons in both conflict and non-conflict settings. This is a shocking statistic, but it's also unsurprising, as small arms are the most prolific weapon in circulation, with an estimated 1 billion small arms globally. Illicit arms are a key factor in the violence and abuse of a large range of human rights, from sexual and gender-based violence to the right to education, water, and food security. The presence of illicit weaponry has been strongly correlated to localized violence, violent extremism, and violent crime, including the trafficking in narcotics and people. The need to combat illicit arms flows has been acknowledged as a core component in conflict prevention, human rights, sustainable development, and gender equality. And this has been reflected in Sustainable Development Goals 16.4, the UN Secretary General's Agenda for Disarmament, multiple UN peacekeeping mandates, the Women, Peace, Security Agenda, and in the preamble of the ATT itself. Due to the destabilizing effects of arms, robust, effective measures against the diversion of arms are needed. Under the ATT, states agreed to adopt common international standards, shared responsibility, and greater transparency in the area of international arms transfers. In a sector which has historically been very opaque, the adoption of the Armstroy Treaty was a monumental achievement. Combating diversion is a central tenet of the ATT. Under Article 11 of the treaty, states are obliged to take measures to prevent the diversion of conventional weapons through risk assessments, national export controls, mitigation measures, and the fostering of cooperation and information sharing between state parties. As Hima has outlined, diversion can occur at any stage of the export process, and the arms in question can transit through multiple jurisdictions. Gaps in regulation, risk mitigation measures, or export and importation controls at any point in the export process between states can be exploited, and arms diverted from their intended purpose. Stockpile management and security following an arms transfer is also critical in ensuring arms are not removed or diverted to illicit use. Diverted arms can remain operational and in circulation for years, if not decades, compounding insecurity and contributing to protracted armed conflict and patterns of violence. It's for these reasons that a common understanding of diversion and harmonized implementation measures between states are needed to ensure the lowest possible risk of diversion. ATT states parties have been heavily engaged in the topic of diversion since the treaty was adopted, with 2 working groups and a sub-working group, each considering diversion-related issues at different points. Diversion has been the thematic focus for CSP4, CSP6, and is now likely to be the thematic focus of CSP7. Frequent side events and engagements with civil society aids our information sharing and policy development. The recent establishment of the Diversion Information Exchange Forum during CSP6 will aid states' efforts to tackle issues of illicit transfers and diversion of arms through the sharing of more sensitive information. However, gaps still exist between state parties in the implementation of diversion and mitigation measures. There's not a standardized approach within the ATT framework, as state parties have different requirements, risk levels, and resources to address diversion risk. Noting these differences, improvements in policy coherence between states and the application of similar risk assessment procedures can greatly improve the implementation of diversion mitigation measures with minimal resource and capacity implications. The paper being launched today can serve as an invaluable tool to officials in analyzing diversion risks when assessing export applications and aid policymakers in identifying potential policy measures which may best suit their individual needs. The paper itself draws on years of discussions, interviews with government officials, and the expertise of the authors to identify good practice for states to learn from and identify opportunities to improve progress. The development of risk diversion questionnaire can be universally applicable to all state parties. It can help standardize practice when assessing diversion risks in a way that is practical to the processing of license applications. The full effective implementation of the anti-diversion measures detailed in the ATT can have significant positive implications for global security, peace, sustainable development, and gender equality, and the report being launched today can help us in achieving this goal. Our panel is going to walk us through this report and their research, and I'm very excited to hear what they will be sharing with us. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the authors for the excellent work which has gone into this publication, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So I'll hand back to Hina, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Emma. Very good to recall why the Armstroy Treaty is so critical in better regulating the legal transfers of conventional weapons, but within it, the responsibilities of those state parties to do what they can in reducing and mitigating the risk of diversion. Thank you for recalling that. I also found that what you mentioned about the broader impact and applicability to conflict prevention, humanitarian response, and sustainable development is a critical factor in making sure that this conversation is not seen in isolation. So thank you for that. I think another element that was quite important is acknowledging that states have indeed national controls in place, but that the maturity of those systems may vary considerably across the world, and that this is a cooperative effort amongst all parties involved in a transfer. So this is a very good segue, really, into going into the expert panel that is available to us today. And first and foremost, of course, up first is Rachel Stoll. Many of you, of course, know Rachel. She's the Vice President and the Director of the Conventional Defense Program at the Stimson Center. Before introducing and giving the floor over to Rachel for the presentation, I also want to acknowledge, as a side note, we have a very unique expert panel today. Actually, in fact, all three speakers that we have are alumni of the Middlebury Institute for International Studies. So this is a very unique setup that we have. So with that, Rachel, please do share with us the study that you have undertaken and how it might be informative to the community of practice. Thank you.
Thanks, Hima. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Hopefully this works. Those of you who know me know this is not my strength. There we go. Yay. It is really a pleasure to be here today to share the Zoom stage with not only my fellow Miss alumni, but really with great partners. And in particular, to thank Emma and the Government of Ireland for their support in this project. It's always great when you have a partnership with governments on these issues. And I think that this partnership has been quite fruitful and a delight to be part of. I also want to thank the civil society partners that Humayu mentioned at the beginning that are part of this consortium, really, of organizations looking to undertake practical measures to address diversion. So I just want to say their names quickly. So Verity Coyle, Paul Holtum, Jonah Leff, Ines Mohammed, Rob Perkins, Humayu Shiotani, and Brian Wood for their insights and advice, and really a great partnership and consortium that is making a difference. There's a lot of good work being done on the topic of diversion, not just from the four organizations represented here today, but around the world. And I think there's great resources available. And I'm really pleased that we were able to work with so many great partners to develop this tool. We wrote this report to offer really a status update on the initiatives within the ATT process that aim to help states minimize the risk of weapons diversion, as well as to provide a good practice compendium on methods that states can use to help address and mitigate such risks. So the report, as I'll talk about, includes recommendations for states to improve their national practices and a questionnaire at the end for licensing officers that we hope will serve as a useful tool for governments. And as Emma mentioned, the report really draws on the extensive research on the types of diversion and associated risks. It's informed by interviews with government officials, analyses of ATT, public ATT reports, and the UNPOA for insights on states' practices to prevent, detect, and address weapons diversion. So I want to just quickly go through some of the meat, as it were, of the report. We really start by looking at diversion risks and why diversion is a key national security concern. And many of you participating today have heard all of this before, but unregulated weapons really can perpetuate and exacerbate conflict and armed violence and facilitate serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, and of course contribute to insecurity and instability. And a large portion of diversions are related to diversion of such arms. And that's why we see diversion as its own article within the ATT. Diversion, as we've talked about, can occur at any stage throughout the life cycle of an arms transfer, and that would include prior to the transfer itself, during the transfer, or after importation, and of course, as Humayu mentioned, from storage or national stockpiles post-delivery. The transferred weapons, as we know, can remain operational. The associated risks of diversion can persist years or even decades after their production and original transfer, which of course further complicates efforts to mitigate diversion. So we conclude, of course, that it's important for states to address a range of arms transfer activities as part of their national transfer control measures and diversion mitigation efforts. I put this list up. This may look familiar, particularly to Jonah, but may look familiar to others participating today, because it highlights the typology of diversion which I think really helps us identify and helps transfer control authorities identify the risks and identify where to strengthen national control systems to prevent, detect, and address diversion. So this list was developed by Conflict Armament Research and throughout their important work tracking weapons supplies into armed conflicts. Further insights into this typology can be found in extensive research conducted by the Small Arms Survey, UN panels of experts, and as Himaya mentioned, a joint research project amongst all the groups that are represented here. So in addition to the different types of diversion, there are several risks throughout the transfer chain that affect the likelihood of weapons diversion. And this is a box from the paper itself, which highlights some of those risks. So we know that incidents can occur at all stages in the transfer chain, and therefore, as we're looking at mitigation measures, we need to think about the entirety of the transfer chain when trying to address solutions. And we can talk more about what that might look like in the Q&A. There are several ongoing initiatives in which key stakeholders are trying to develop and strengthen measures to prevent and mitigate arms diversion. The report highlights two of those, the UN Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and the Arms Trade Treaty, both of which are looking at their core to reduce risks inherent to the global arms trade. So the UN POA, of course, contains guidance on several measures that states can take to strengthen counter-diversion efforts, including establishing laws and regulations to control arms production, regulating brokers and brokering activities, promoting weapons tracing to help better identify points of diversion, strengthening stockpile management. There's a whole host of suggestions and processes within the UN POA. The Arms Trade Treaty also identifies several actions that states can take at each stage of the transfer chain to mitigate diversion risks. These include examining the parties involved in an export prior to transfer, exchanging information with importing and transit or transshipment countries, also with exporters, reporting on measures that are taken to address diversion, as well as many others. Part of the reason we did this report is that although the ATT does provide some standardized guidance and some requirements, states often lack a shared understanding of how the treaty has actually contributed to reducing diversion risks since its entry into force in 2014, and what new opportunities might exist to improve policies and practices to better tackle the arms trade. The ATT, however, has been really active in talking about the risk of diversion. Within the ATT process, 2 CSP, Conference of States Parties presidencies, have selected diversion as their core focus for their terms. The treaty's working groups on effective treaty implementation and on transparency and reporting have taken steps to help these states' parties better address and develop measures to mitigate the risk of diversion. The working group on effective treaty implementation selected diversion as one of its first 3 priority issues. It created a subgroup on the issue, and the working group on transparency and reporting helped establish the Diversion Information Exchange Forum, which is meant to serve as a channel for informal voluntary exchanges on concrete cases of suspected or detected diversion. So there's a lot of activity around diversion. And so it's time that we start thinking about what are good practices that we can undertake when we want to prevent and mitigate diversion. So governments have developed several elements of good practice. Such examples are at the national, the regional levels. They're usually organized into 2 main approaches: measures to prevent and mitigate the risk of diversion, and measures taken when a diversion is detected. And there are several measures that states can take to address diversion through their national systems. The report includes a much more comprehensive list than what you see on the slide, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of things that we're talking about. Other good practice measures have been identified by private sector associations, civil society organizations. These aren't always mentioned by states, but really can serve as useful elements for establishing national practice. And I think you're going to hear today of ways that civil society is contributing to this effort. So I just want another plug for civil society's participation in these processes. There's expertise, there's knowledge, there's experience in addressing many of these issues. You've heard me say this before, but one of the things that I think Stimson does particularly well, and I think is one of our biggest strengths, is that we don't just lay out this typology and the measures and the policy recommendations. We really want to put all of these ideas into practice. So in this report, we've really thought about how do we take all this good analysis and good practice and make it implementable. So this paper, much like the gender-based violence report that we launched last week, this is sort of the partner to that report. We're trying to equip licensing officials with tools so they can effectively implement the ATT and prevent and mitigate diversion at a very basic and pragmatic level. So this guidance questionnaire, which is in the report, can be used by licensing officers and their information sources when undertaking a risk assessment or identifying good practice on diversion. So we developed these questions, and I'm going to quickly scroll through them, but you can see them all in the report. We developed these questions in partnership with governments and by asking licensing officers what kind of information would be most helpful to you when you're making your licensing decisions and trying to identify potential mitigation strategies. So a license comes across your desk, you're trying to judge all of these different criteria, figure out what the risk is, if it's a good idea, what information do you need to know? So some of the questions are quite open-ended. Others are much more specific and have like a checklist almost for licensing officers to ask. And we really want this to be the start of a conversation. If governments are not getting the information they need, then they can talk to their information sources and see if they can delve a little deeper. If states are unable to get the information that is required to make a proper licensing decision, then governments can't adequately make their transfer decisions and identify the most effective diversion implementation or diversion mitigation strategies and really implement the ATT to its fullest intent. So our hope is that licensing officers will either tear out or print out this page of the report so they can have this questionnaire nearby when they are doing their due diligence. And again, happy to talk about these questions. Again, some of them are open-ended, as you see here on this slide. Some of them have sort of an A, B, C, or D trying to identify a checklist. So I'm going to conclude just by reiterating that we did this report. We're part of this consortium and this project because we really see diversion as a key international security concern. And we outlined some next steps for the ATT in the report to effectively address diversion. And I think it's really important that not only do we continue to talk about these issues, but that we remain very transparent in these conversations so that others can learn from them. The ATT has really prioritized efforts to prevent and mitigate diversion. It's established numerous initiatives and opportunities. And I think that states can really work together to implement measures to combat diversion, but also to work with civil society to identify some good practice and expertise along the way. So I will stop there and turn it back to Humayun.
Thanks, Rachel. Very interesting indeed. And congratulations on the report release. I think that in particular, the questionnaire is worthy and meriting of further dialogue with let's say, licensing officers and the community of practice more broadly to see how, what type of information can be gathered and exchanged as a form of facilitating further dialogue on this topic. Just wanted to also acknowledge the typology that you outlined, and that us as partners, we're looking to revitalize those typologies a bit, as we recognize that the types of diversion are evolving over time and space. But I think one of the two things additionally that I thought was quite useful is I think there's going to be greater amount of interest moving ahead on measures to respond to cases of diversion. I mean, what do we practically do? And this is going to be a critical component in making sure that the treaty itself remains relevant as well when diversion occur. And I think in terms of the risk assessment factors that you talked about, I think there will be great amount of interest here in pre-transfer stage as to how to better get more information about the end user. How does one then assure, or let's say, look into the assurance of those end user agreements, and subsequently, look at post-delivery cooperation stages of end user control agreements. So those will be, I think, additional areas that perhaps it would be very interesting to discuss in the Q&A. And I want to acknowledge there's a lot of good questions coming in the Q&A. I'm not going to address them right now, but they're really interesting. So I'll be certain to try to cover most of them in the time available. So with this, thank you, Rachel, once again. Moving on to the next speaker, Nick. Nick is from the Small Arms Survey. Nice to have you here, Nick. And he is the head of data and analytics, as well as a senior researcher for the Small Arms Survey. His research interests include illicit flows of arms and ammunition, as well as armed actors' self-governance mechanism. His work has focused on both Africa and Europe, and is currently focusing on research on the Caribbean as well. So Nick, please, with this, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Himayu, and I want to join my partners here in thanking the Government of Ireland for making this event possible, and the Stimson Center for inviting us. I come from the Small Arms Survey. We're based here in Geneva, Switzerland, and we've looked at the issues being discussed here for some time, and some of my colleagues in particular have made contributions to this specific project that brings us together. What I do today is present another report that looks at, that was released in December last year, called the Trade Update 2020. This is a report that, if I can change my slide, here you go. This is a report that we've basically published in various forms every year almost since 2003, I believe. And that provides an overview of authorized transfers, authorized small arms transfers, so not all conventional arms, but small arms and light weapons and ammunition. We also look at transparency in reporting, and through the tool that you may know, the Transparency Barometer. And we also include a case study section where we look at ammunition transfers to Africa. And I think the reason why this is relevant to today's discussion is that there are, of course, a number of very specific measures that states can take to prevent diversion, but I think we should also keep in mind the big picture, which is that to prevent diversion, you also need to understand and have a good idea of the extent and nature of the authorized trade, because if you don't know the authorized trades, then you will have a harder time understanding how things go missing, how things go diverted, and what went wrong. So I think it's from that perspective that this presentation brings some more general background to this discussion. With respect to authorized transfers, our report looks at what is called UN Comtrade data. So it's the UN Commodity Trade Statistics. It's a database of customs data. It has caveats, and I'll discuss some of those later, but it still remains one of the main, most comprehensive sources for looking at the authorized trade, because both importing states and exporting states report to it. And as such, it provides a good sense of trends, especially among those reporting states. We find in 2020 edition, which looks at the data up until 2017, that the global value of the trade in small arms and light weapons reached 6.5 billion in 2017. This is slight decrease compared with 2016, but as you can see, it's still a very high level when compared with the previous 16 years. With respect to the exporters, you see in this infographic that the world of small arms exporters is a rather consolidated sphere and sector. We counted 38 exporters that we categorize as either major or top. Major means that they exported more than $10 million worth of small arms, whereas top is more than 100 million. 4 states that you see here exported more than 500 million. These are the US, Italy, Brazil, and Germany. And together, these major and top exporters account for about 98% of the trade reported on UN Comtrade. With respect to weapons categories, ammunition has been the largest category in recent years, and this continues to be true. It accounts for 41% of the global trade in between 2015 and 2017. And it's followed by other categories, including handguns, as well as sporting and hunting firearms. The situation with importers is a bit less concentrated. We count 69 major and top importers using the same thresholds. So the major importers are those that imported at least $10 million worth of small arms in 2017, whereas the top ones are 100 million and more. Although there are more states that are major and top importers, you see here that the United States accounts for a large proportion of this trade, about 32% on its own. But we note that in 2017, the value of its imports, the value of US imports, has actually decreased by 19%. And so the reason that the overall global reported trade has remained quite stable is because we've seen quite a dramatic spike in the Asia-Pacific region, that is actually attributable to Middle Eastern states. In 2017, we counted, as I noted earlier, 13 top importers, so importers that imported more than 100 million. Well, 6 of these 13 were based in the Middle East, and together their imports accounted for 20% of global imports. So we see with these trends that the Middle Eastern region has become a significant part of the trade as importers. Let me now turn to the Small Arms Transparency Barometer, which is the second part of this report. And by the way, I will share a hyperlink to the report at the end of the presentation, so you can flip through it later on. So the Transparency Barometer is a tool we put in place back in 2003. Its goal is to assess the reporting practices by major small arms exporters, and we currently assess the practices of 50 states. This is because we take into account any state that reached the $10 million threshold at any year since 2003. We look at sources such as the UN Comtrade database that I just mentioned, but also the UN Register, the UN Program of Action reports, ATT initial and annual reports, and a range of national and regional arms export reports. We score each of these exporters based on 47 criteria that belong to 7 broader parameters. And this methodology is quite elaborate, and it's all available online as well as in the annex of the reports. Although the top score is the maximum score is 25 for the barometer, and it's actually quite doable to reach 25 if you look at the scores achieved by each criteria by at least one state. I mean, it's actually very doable to reach very nearly the 25 maximum. However, so last year, when looking at the reporting practices of states for their exports in 2017, we noted an average score for all these exporters of only 12.4, which is just below the average score. And so clearly, there's much more that could be done to improve reporting and transparency with respect to these arms exports. We did note some improvements, including among the top 5 most transparent exporters, and also a handful of other exporters that managed to increase their scores by 1.5 or more points last year. However, we saw very little improvement, actually no improvement among the least transparent exporters that you see here. And we also saw a similar number of states that lost 1.5 points or more. And so overall, it is a rather stagnating picture in terms of our transparency barometer, where we don't see much improvement. In the third section of the trade update, we look a little bit closer at ammunition transfers from Opaque exporters to Africa. The reason we focus on this particular aspect of the trade is that, first of all, we, based on the Comtrade data, the available authorized trade data, ammunition represents the largest share of reported imports to Africa. With 42% of the total is valued at $98 million for 2017. However, we know very well, and part of it is due to reporting, is that there's a lack of transparency among some of the African importers. A lot of the data that leads to this number of 98 million is really due to a limited number of states that report quite regularly. And also we noticed that states that are affected by armed conflict or in the vicinity of these armed conflicts tend to report less. So it's really a partial picture. Also, we know from other sources that less transparent exporters are involved in supplying the region. And so we think that it's a region where the extent of the trade really is underreported in some of the official reporting mechanisms. And so in this part of the report, we look at several untapped data sets to try to get a better sense of the nature of this unrecorded part of the trade. I'll just cite a few here, and this much more detail in the report itself, but we looked at data sets of seized ammunition in different conflict zones, especially in the DRC and Mali, where we were able to obtain access to data sets of small caliber ammunition, where it was possible to identify the manufacturers and the year of manufacture. What we see is that there's a lot of aging ammunition, but there's also more recent ammunition that suggests that this ammunition was diverted relatively recently, and some of it comes from the less transparent states. We also examined the very rich literature produced by UN monitoring groups, either a group of experts or panels of experts, which really contain depth of information. And for those familiar with these reports, they can include hundreds of pages of annexes with a lot of detail on the actual equipment found in the hands of unauthorized users, and some of the ways in which they got there. And we also acquired some interesting and sort of surprising data sets, and this is what you see here, the table on the left. So this is a data set that was shared by an NGO based in Washington called C4ADS. And they basically collect data from commercial outfits that collect customs information from governments that surprisingly is not available through UN Comtrade or any of the other international sources that I described earlier when talking about the Transparency Barometer. So, for example, in this table, several cases were just not reported to any of these instruments, yet the data exists and it's available to these commercial entities. So that was actually quite interesting in knowing that some states do collect the data and somehow share it with some entities, yet it doesn't go through to some of the main international platforms. So perhaps to wrap up, I think what this shows is that what we found, I think, through looking at these different sources, is that there are arms transfers and ammunition transfers happening from less transparent exporters to areas affected by conflicts, areas affected by arms embargoes. It's often not reported in the main platforms in place. We've seen also that in some cases, and the group of experts that works on the DRC, for example, has documented a series of transfers to the armed forces of the DRC that were not notified to the Security Council, so that did not meet the exemption system obligations of that sanctions regime. So these transfers make it to these entities and are subsequently found to have been partly diverted to the stocks of armed groups. And so this clearly to us shows that there's an issue with the risk assessments undertaken by some of these exporting states. And to further conclude that both I think transparency by the major exporters and including states that appear to have the data and to share it with some parties, but could be shared more broadly. This could really help better understand this more opaque aspect of the trade, together with some of these other untapped data sources that I mentioned, that can also help better understand how diversion occurs and how to prevent it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nick. Very, very interesting. And thank you for combining 3 different sort of studies into one presentation with a limited time. I understand that that's challenging, but I think a lot was shared, a bit to digest. But thank you for sharing essentially the supply side issue at the moment and the scale of the authorized transfers and the challenges associated to the transparency of those transfers. And I just wanted to acknowledge 2 points in particular. One, rightly so, I think you focused on ammunition, and this is a big question that I think the community also has. In particular, you mentioned 42% authorized trade, but personally, as moderator, I have also questions as to the transfer that happens subsequently as a re-export, let's say, that may not be originally authorized or authorized with the consent of the original exporter. And I wonder to what extent that volume represents its percentage. I understand that lack of transparency, as you noted, poses challenges to these things, but I think that would be very interesting. That also raises another question, perhaps, in terms of parts and components, but maybe we can come back to that in the Q&A as well. So moving right away into the final speaker, Jonah. Jonah is the Director of Operations at the Conflict Armaments Research, where he oversees weapons tracing operations in over 25 conflict-affected countries. He was previously working with the Small Arms Survey, and previous to that, he served in the UN Security Council Sanctions Expert Monitoring Group pertaining to Darfur, Eritrea, and Somalia. So, Jonah, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Himayu. Let me just share my screen. Great. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. First off, I just wanted to thank you, Rachel, and the Stimson Center for hosting this important event, as well as the Government of Ireland for all of your support on this important initiative. Like the others, it truly is a privilege and honor to be up here, not only with my fellow Middlebury Institute alum, but also members of this consortium of civil society organizations that are working to tackle these difficult issues that are being presented today. So just by way of a short introduction, conflict armament research, as Himayu mentioned, we support governments and security and defense forces in more than 25 different conflict-affected countries throughout the world in order to identify and track illicit weapon flows into those conflicts. We take a diagnostic approach to diversion, and this is in order to identify and detect the who, what, where, why, and when of diversion and to provide that information first and foremost to policymakers, export control agencies on the export side, but also security forces and governments on the import side so that they can enhance their own end-use controls to prevent and mitigate diversion. In addition to the analytic support that we provide to governments, we also provide innovative solutions and tools to enhance effective weapon and ammunition management and control. And so as part of this presentation, I will be focusing on one of the countries that we work, that we have been supporting really over the last decade. That is Somalia. And we've been doing it partly, I should mention, in partnership with UNIDIR. And over that decade, there have been some significant developments in Somalia. Just for a bit of background, I think one of the biggest, I guess, achievements and developments was the creation of the federal government in 2012. Following this also led to the expulsion of Al-Shabaab, who had control over Mogadishu in cooperation with the African Union peacekeeping force, AMISOM, in Mogadishu. Following the establishment of the federal government, the UN Security Council partially lifted or modified the arms embargo so that the government could begin importing weapons. There were some commitments and requirements that the Security Council imposed relating to reporting back on imports, as well as various projects and assurances to enhance their end-use controls. And one of those was the establishment of a joint verification team on the import of weapons. The federal government of Somalia selected us, CAR, to work with them jointly on this initiative. And so we report back to the UN Security Council with the government. Really, it's the National Security Advisor's Office within the federal government on a biannual basis. So the mandate of the JVT, for short, is to verify the end user of all imported weapons and ammunition, as well as to assess the distribution supply chain. So to really look at the paperwork, the paper trail, and what kind of documentation the government maintains to understand the distribution of this material. So as part of the JVT, we've also, and as a result of identifying some gaps in the distribution system that the government had in place, we began rolling out a record-keeping system to the Somali forces. The next slide is an example of when we first started this work, one of the manual record-keeping really templates that one of the security forces had to manage its weapons. Now, you can see, very quickly that this they definitely have challenges here. There was a lot of work to be done, but I should really state that this is a demonstration of will and an appetite to manage their weapon stockpiles and to understand and register where weapons are at any one time. So they just needed support and capacity in enhancing this system. So quite quickly, working with UNMAS, the UN Mine Action Service, as well as in cooperation with the federal government, we developed a, we modified the manual record-keeping template for all of their armorers to use on the issue and receipt of weapons. And here's an example of one of those registers that was maintained in one of the armories. We've done this primarily with the Somali police force in Mogadishu. And on the map, you can see all of the various police stations, and the dark purple waypoints are those police stations that we've confirmed are now using the new logbooks, this manual system, and the light blue police stations are where these logbooks are not yet in use. But you can see that now the majority are using these, and at some point this year we will get to the remaining police stations to ensure that there is a manual system in place. So moving over, in parallel to this manual record keeping system, we thought that there was ample appetite and capacity for introducing a digital registration system. And we did this in partnership with the National Security Advisor's Office with the Somali police force in Mogadishu. Here in the photo, you can see one of the police officers registering one of the weapons in their stockpile. So just to zoom in on the app itself, this is a customized app that we had translated into Somali, and you can enter all the relevant information on the weapon type, including the photos, including GPS coordinates of where the weapon was documented by the police themselves, as well as the assigned officer and his or her signature, which you can see on the bottom. All of this information is collated on a backend server and database that is accessible with the National Security Advisor's Office, as well as the head of the police force, so that they can see a broad picture on where their weapons are at any one time. Now, the one drawback from this digital registration system is that it is static in the sense that it doesn't actually track the forward movement of weapons in real time. And for that, we need a database, a tracking database system, which I'll get to in a minute. But first, you can see that on the digital registration, since November of 2020, the police have registered 4,200 weapons in Mogadishu, and this represents almost 85% of their entire inventory. And so on the map, you can see all the various dots. Some of them are different colors, representing information that I don't need to get into at this point. But basically, these are all of the locations where the police have registered their weapons onto this digital system. Now, I mentioned that we are also working on developing a WAM database, which essentially is an asset tracking tool. And this is a mock-up version of what it might look like, which includes all the information from the initial receipt of the weapon when it is imported, and then all the way down following the distribution chain to distribution to the assigned soldier or unit, and any forward distribution or disposal of that weapon ultimately as well. In addition, there will be a portal within the database that will enable the National Security Advisor's Office to be able to generate reports that they can not only share across the various ministries and throughout the forces and in government, as well as with their partners, but also to enable them to report back more effectively to the UN Security Council, which they're obligated to do in order to show their obligations, their achievements, and report back in an accurate fashion. So just a few closing reflections. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to ensure that we have sufficient time for all the Q&A. I think that this is a real demonstration that practical WAM solutions do not need to be overly complex, and that there are several options from manual systems to digital or a combination of both. And in fact, they don't need to even be all that expensive. I think that in addition to the achievements that we've seen in Somalia, we can look at other contexts where these types of initiatives might be replicable, not just across sub-Saharan Africa, but in other countries throughout the world. And then one other point that I think is just important to mention is that, all of these initiatives need to be government-led, need to have the buy-in from the governments that are implementing them, and that this promotes a really important sense of ownership and accountability so that they can take these tools, and in the case of Somalia, beyond the life of the arms embargo. Ultimately, the arms embargo will be lifted and there won't be UN sanctions on Somalia, and the government will have these tools in place to account for its weapons and have its own inspectorate regime to be able to conduct monitoring and its own assessments and analysis of diversion challenges and efficacy. And then lastly, just from an ATT perspective, I think that these practical WAM measures are really effective confidence builders on the end use side that states can consider when they're conducting diversion risk assessments, and that these should be promoted, they should be factored in, and there should be real knowledge of what's actually happening on the ground. Not only the challenges and the bad reporting, but also some of these achievements that are taking place, that may go less reported. So I think with that, I will leave it there, and happy to answer any questions that may have arisen.
Thank you, Jonah. I'm sure there will be plenty. Thank you so much for sharing. First and foremost, that weapon and ammunition management is possible in transitional settings, including in situations where there are partial lifting of arms embargoes in place, where by design, they're meant to strengthen the security forces and their capabilities with regards to certain categories of weapons. I think that was very important to hear. And in this regard, in the context of the Arms Trade Treaty as well, it's very important to bear in mind the importer responsibility. And in this regard, the way that you describe the national ownership and the political will there is a critical component. I think it was also really, really important for you that you discuss a top-down and bottom-up approach, and with it, the central piece being record keeping. In fact, it is true when we talk about preventing diversion or understanding even if diversion took place, without a baseline of what really exists in the force, it's difficult to know if diversion has occurred at all. So I think, building this bottom-up approach of record keeping and strengthening those responsibilities to build the chain of custody is a critical component that you elaborated. And I was very pleased to see all the progress that's being made by the federal government in Somalia with CAR and other partners' support. Colleagues, this is a really good segue now. We have about 25 minutes. That's great for discussion. And we have a lot of questions from the participants. So if I may, I'd like to just group them, some of them, in my own words. I won't be necessarily reflecting the questions verbatim for participants' awareness, but I will be translating them in my own, capacity. I hope that's okay. I would like to just start by you, Jonah. And I apologize, maybe this is a tough one, huh? But I want to go directly to you. First, let's address the so what question, right? Let's address that because, okay, there are these policies in place, there are these practices that are happening, but diversion continues to occur. And when they do occur, they continue to occur, and there are violations that are seen quite often, including, as reported by the panel reports, quite blatant and deliberate violations that take place. And so let's talk about the so what. So what does this mean? What more could be done when actually diversion occurs? What type of cooperation can be done between the parties involved in the transfer? What are some of the practical measures? That would be my first question. And second question to you, Jonah, as a quick follow-up is, you started to talk a little bit about the responsibilities of the importing state, right? What more could they do at the national level to further prevent diversion down the supply chain? Are there things that can be done at the post-delivery stage in cooperation with the supplier or original supplier? Or is this something, like you said, about as a context or model of JVT, joint verification? Are there things that can be done at the time of import or down the supply chain post-distribution that can prevent or help to prevent diversion? Let's start with those two. Jonah, over to you.
Thank you, Himayu. I thought I was going to get a break, but let's jump right in. I'm happy to. Well, first off, I think your two questions are very good. They're also linked, so I think I'll answer them kind of as one. So the so what and what more can be done. I think on a very basic level, I think there needs to be enhanced cooperation between exporters and importers. Progress has been made. I think these processes and international instruments that have been put in place over the last few decades have provided guidelines for cooperation and assistance to low resource states. But I think there's still a long way to go. Number one, I'll just begin on the export side. I think that, and this may answer some of the questions that I saw popping up in the chat. I think in terms of end use assurances and conducting risk assessments, I think one important element that needs to be kind of promoted more is this idea of post-delivery verification. Our experience in Somalia is one example of this, and granted it's being done under a UN Security Council resolution mandate, but I think that it poses a potential model for other states to look at, whether it's being conducted by the importing state itself or imposed by the exporter or a combination of the two. I think it's really crucial for there to be enhanced monitoring of where weapons are going. Oftentimes when weapons are supplied into a country, they go to capital, and most of those weapons do not stay in capital. So to request an end-use assurance from the importing state to say that they've received those weapons, that they're being stored in capital is not enough, because those weapons oftentimes have further supplies down the chain and end up with other users. On the import side, I think I'll just say, the answer is very much the same. I think that for those that are in transition or have just come out of conflict, I think that there is a lot that needs to be done in terms of building confidence to be able to convince states to supply weapons to those states. So there is some onus on them to demonstrate that they are taking these issues seriously and working with partners and donors to implement some of the measures that we've discussed today. But I'm sure there are others, so I'll leave those for some of my colleagues to respond to. Thanks, Hima.
Thank you, Jonah. I appreciate you going directly into this. I think the important elements you noted were, I think on the verification side, there's much to be said further, because in effect, the verification is a stock-taking exercise that is an obligation or commitment of a national control system. So in fact, to what extent that country of an importing function cooperates with the suppliers up to those states. But regardless of that cooperation, each country really should be able to articulate a system that really looks after and accounts for their own weapons down the supply chain without necessarily an exporting entity interfering with that. So I think in terms of the bottom-up approach, it's really a combination of factors. I think that was really clearly elaborated by you. And in terms of record-keeping system and structure, I'm taking note that there's a lot of interesting comments and questions that are coming to you, Jonah, about the record-keeping system, how you set that up, how that could be discussed further with other record-keeping systems and databases that have been created by other partners like UNODC. So I think there's an interest there to have a further dialogue on this. I just want to acknowledge that. Let me move on to you, Nick. Nick, there's, we talked a little bit about let's say, importer and exporter, but of course, very well that the transfers are not, let's say, unilateral in a way between two parties. There are many parties involved in the transfer. And I'd be quite curious to hear from you a little bit, from your experience, the role of customs as well as transits and transshipment entities. If you are able to talk a little bit about that, that would be quite interesting to hear. The second question that I'd like to pose to you is the types of ammunition and arms within the category you mapped out. Like, are you seeing particular types of ammunition, or are you seeing a particular types of weapon that has been mapped or vulnerable to, let's say, diversion? This is the reason why I'm asking this is because you're familiar, Nick. I've read your small arms survey study as well. That's looking at, for example, in Europe, blank firing firearms. Those have been diverted quite. Those have been documented fairly well in the European context. But what are we seeing in the rest of the world? I'd like to ask these two questions about the other stakeholders involved in the transfer. What do they, what their roles and responsibilities may be to prevent it, prevent diversion, and what are we seeing in terms of types of arms and ammunition? Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Hima. I think in terms of the role of customs and transit officials, actually it's quite key because the data set, the main data set used to monitor the authorized trade is actually generated by customs, and it's a key source of data. And it has remained, even though it has many limitations in terms of its comprehensiveness, it's still a major source. Now, what I think we're trying to show with our report last year is that there is a benefit in opening it up quite a bit. And I think some of the data sources that Jonah was presenting, on the import side are critical in terms of supplementing this, but also, some of these other untapped data sets that seem to exist, and yet for some reason, some states, and there were some questions, what do you do with the states that repeatedly violate arms embargoes? And obviously there's little you can do in terms of practical measures to engage them. But I think we also saw that there's some states that, have data, but just don't centralize it or report it to a lot of these mechanisms. And that, some of these exporters could really be engaged and supported to improve their practices. And I think, a key thing that that also came out of Jonah's presentation is this importance of sort of fusioning all the data sources and really trying to make sense of the overall picture. There's a lot of support in the EU for entities called firearm focal points, where a lot of the weapons intelligence and ammunition intelligence is centralized in a single entity, and where all these data sets are recouped, so that you have a sense of what came in as authorized, but also what is seized and how to connect all these things. And I think that's really the key moving forward, is to ensure that none of these sources of crucial data are left unaddressed. With respect to blank firing weapons and ammunition, as you said, it's a very recognized issue in Europe, and there's been a number of efforts to tackle this. These weapons have also been exported and seized to embargoed countries in significant numbers like Somalia and Libya, and we've seen that they've trickled down in converted form in the Sahel and other countries. In an initial review we did a few years back that was more global in nature, we found that it was a concern for many countries and virtually on every continent, but there's not yet a full global assessment of the scale of this issue. The challenge with documenting the ammunition for this is that often the ammunition is there's different ways to convert these weapons. So sometimes they'll be converted to shoot real ammunition, which is not distinguishable even in ballistics data sets. It'll be the same caliber as a real weapon. But there's also in some cases, the caliber in itself indicates that it's blank ammunition. So in that case, it can be picked up, but it's quite difficult to document in quantitative terms because of all these caveats. And we know that there's a lot of concern about this among especially the forensic community.
Thank you so much, Nick. Very interesting to hear all those reflections. Thank you for that. Rachel, I'm coming to you now. I've had a few questions from the Q&A that's really focusing on transparency. And I think the most obvious question that should be posed right now is, how do you effectively promote or encourage states that are not being transparent to be more transparent? How do you go about that? I know you've been working on this for years, and you've sort of maybe mastered the way to go, but from a strategic level to a more practical level, could you elaborate on the full spectrum? Because what you might consider as an encouragement at the strategic level may be very different to what might be done in the practical national level, because it might be structural or capacity issues as well. So if you could just elaborate a little bit further on how to promote further transparency on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Hima. You know that transparency is near and dear to my heart, not just because I like to look at all this information and data, but because I think there's an inherent value here. We're not just being transparent for transparency's sake, but there's a real purpose behind transparency. And I think transparency should be seen as something that we incentivize. It's not a punishment to be transparent. There are many benefits in terms of understanding the transfer supply chain, the actors involved, identifying gaps and weaknesses, identifying where capacity needs to be built and where assistance could be acquired. Moreover, when you are transparent in your system, right, it gives your exporting or transshipping states more confidence in your ability to safeguard and control the items coming in or through your border. So I don't think transparency is really, there's a lot of benefits there. It's not supposed to punish a state for sharing when there are weaknesses. In fact, sharing those weaknesses or sharing those potential challenges provides an opportunity to strengthen those gaps, or to strengthen the capacity to fill those gaps, or to address some challenges that the system has. So if, for example, you say we have a particular storage facility and there seems to be a lot of theft, if you're transparent about that, you may be able to work with a partner government or within your own government to implement additional security measures, to fortify the enclosure, whatever the case may be. So there are real opportunities for growth and progress. I think there's always a fear that information that is shared will be used to shame or to prevent something from happening. And so there may be times when that information is shared privately between states. There's also some national security concerns, right? If you say, I have a huge weakness in this part of my supply chain, or I have this set of facilities have huge safety problems, right? Obviously, that would make them targets. So there are sometimes reasons when perhaps you are not as open or public, but that you're sharing that information with those that can assist you in strengthening the measures to prevent and mitigate diversion. So again, seeing this as not a transparency doesn't mean you are writing in bright, shining, blinking lights like problem, 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 or you're not saying, here's where we're focusing all of our resources so the other pieces are left uncontrolled, but rather that you're using transparency as a way to build confidence, to strengthen your own national system, to ensure that you're working in complete openness with your trading partners. If you are comfortable trading lethal weapons with a government, you should be comfortable asking the difficult questions and making sure that those can be safely secured and used appropriately.
Thanks, Rachel. Really interesting. And I want to take a point of departure on the incentive question, right? Because there's a lot of questions coming from the participants about how do we encourage more meaningful engagement on post-delivery cooperation? How do we engage more meaningfully on information sources to be able to conduct effective risk assessments? So I think let me take that. I'm mindful of the time. We have 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is 2 more rounds of questions, but apply to all 3 panelists. And then I'll go back to Emma, before we close, to see if you have any additions that you would like to make. But the first round, open to all 3, is about capacity building and international cooperation and assistance. Because part of the challenge may be, for those who wish to cooperate, let me be very clear about that. For those who wish to cooperate, there is capacity challenges both on the exporter side to be able to use their resources adequately to conduct the risk assessments that they need to do prior to exports, but also if they were to exercise post-delivery cooperation, how do they do that? There's a lot of good lessons learned from various states about how they deal with this on a catch-all type of a setup on dual-use items, but there is a capacity issue that cannot be ignored. So how do we approach this from international cooperation and assistance perspective? So let's open it up. Let's go first, Rachel, Nick, and then back to Jonah. First round, thanks.
Sure, I think this is one of the reasons why we put this paper together in terms of a compendium of good practice, because the ATT specifically focuses on international cooperation and assistance. And in implementing the ATT and the article on diversion, Article 11, it's essential that states identify sort of what information they need to be able to share and where they have gaps in being able to strengthen their own national system. So you're right, they do go very much hand in hand. And it should be a sign of strength to ask for that assistance, to do your own self-analysis of what it is that you would like. In addition, governments have to know what information they want shared, what kind of cooperation is going to further the goals and the objectives that either an arms transfer has or that mitigation and prevention strategies have. So there has to be open communication and information sharing. And if you read the ATT throughout the entire treaty, there is share information, there is provide information too. It is whether it's not only just your record keeping and your reporting, but as part of the export process, the import process, it's recommended in transit, transshipment, and brokering. There has to be that open communication, and supporting states to be able to provide that is really crucial.
Thanks, Rachel. Let's go quickly. Nick, over to you.
Thanks. I'd say that in the international arms control field, there's in some of the work we do collecting data in various regions. We often hear about questionnaire fatigue and the multiple commitments that sometimes very busy national focal points have to deal with. And so I think any effort to try to stagger requests, reporting requirements, also explore synergies, I think would be probably quite helpful in lowering the burden on some states. I think some states, as I noted one case, they have the data, but obviously for some reason they don't report it. So there's definitely an opening there. Another thing maybe to consider is that maybe there is a bit of timidity in reporting because the data either isn't there or there's a fear of being shamed. And I think what's interesting is, in some of the countries like Somalia, where there's been a lot of assistance and actually there's capacity to detect diversion, well, when it's reported, then there's bad press about it. But actually, there should be an effort to also report on the fact that reporting on it is already an achievement that many other countries can do. And we know from questionnaires sent to even developed countries that it's very hard actually to get detailed data on cases of diversion, simply because they don't really look into it and don't have the data to look into it. So I think it's also a responsibility for the sort of research institutions and the media to really shed a different light on that kind of diversion monitoring.
Thanks, Nick. Jonah?
Yeah, I think Nick and Rachel have touched on it, but I guess a couple points. First off, you can't really address capacity building and cooperation without first identifying what the gaps are. And so I think there are a lot of donor-driven agendas out there, and it's a whole industry around this. But I think UNIDIR, you guys have very good experience in your WHAM baseline assessments, which bring all of the relevant stakeholders together, first and foremost, to identify what the gaps are, and then to address those gaps, and to do that in a coordinated fashion. So I think the key is to bring together all those relevant stakeholders. The whole idea of coordination is quite cliche at this point, and there's a lot of talk about it. But if done correctly, it's really important, and it's not all that complex. So that donors can coordinate who's funding what, the various implementers are in the room so that each of them can provide their value adds, as well as all of the relevant national stakeholders and ministries who have mandates to oversee whichever security force or structure that is being discussed. So I think these types of forums are really important, and then once that's put into motion, there needs to be some kind of feedback monitoring mechanism that provides information back to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of that system. So that's my sort of brief, Venn diagram in my mind. But
it's all clear in my mind right now. I'm not sure. Let's hope it's clear in everybody's mind. But let's see. We've got 4 minutes. So what I'm going to do is this. In a minute, right? Let's acknowledge that diversion is a challenge, and it's an important area and an urgent issue to be addressed. So any last remarks from the panelists on any out-of-the-box ideas? Anything that you might want to throw out there? I saw in one of the comments and the questions, why don't we be brave and look into a dedicated council decision or Security Council resolution specific to diversion? Why not? I thought that was an interesting sort of shout out. So any last pitch on out-of-box ideas? All ideas are good ideas at this point. Nobody's going to hold you accountable for them. So Rachel?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's an out-of-the-box idea. I just think it's important to reiterate that this really has to be a holistic approach. It's not just enough to say, put these measures in place. There has to be some enforcement of those measures. There has to be clear training for government officials, what kinds of steps are needed. It can't just be, here's a piece of paper and it's going to say you're going to check off that you've done these 5 things, but it really has to be sort of inherently understood why, how, to what end, and to what benefit. So I want to emphasize that we can't just assume states will implement these provisions without some enforcement, some accountability for the actions that are put in place. I do think there are enough at this point international measures, whether it's a treaty or a voluntary instrument that address diversion, that we could do something. And I'm looking at Emma, on the Security Council, which says, let's have a conversation about diversion, put in place, panels of experts, not just on countries, but panels of experts on a topic to try and address some of these issues. So it is time to be bold, but it's also time for governments to recognize that it can't be, if you don't train your customs officials for why this is important and why they need to look out for it, and you just have your sort of diplomatic position that this is an important step to take, if you don't do those needs assessments, if you're not looking at really providing and asking for assistance, really nothing will change.
Thanks, Rachel. I think, you know what, in the interest of time, I will take that intervention as a consolidated contribution from the 3 of you. Emma, before we close, of course, there's about a minute that we can, I'd like to welcome you to see if you have any remarks that you would like to provide as well. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Himayu. I guess just the panel discussion has really just re-emphasized the fact that diversion exists in the gray area. There is a lack of information, there's a lack of clarity. And we've kind of gone from strength to strength in terms of, I think Jonah really outlined the benefit of small, simple measures and having huge benefits in terms of tracking and tracing of weaponry, which can be very beneficial in terms of combating diversion. And we don't need to complicate solutions in a very practical way. I think in terms of data collection, which we heard from Nicholas, the gaps in data across reporting is very interesting to see. And something that we're very aware of is actually there's a huge amount of duplication in reporting requirements upon states, which actually disincentivizes collation and reporting. So there's probably a discussion to be had there in terms of how we can best address these issues. And then to kind of circle back to Rachel's on transparency, that we really do need to incentivize this as a good thing. I think the more we can engage states on this, the more we can encourage transparency and reporting of this as a good thing, the more we can help them through processes like UNSCAR, like the ATT VTF, like EU Council decisions, which we've seen great progress from in recent years. So just to encourage confidence in trading and supporting. On the Security Council resolution, I'll take that under advisement. It's a quite busy agenda at the moment. But no, I definitely see the merit there, and I don't think exports and conventional weapons diversion has ever been discussed on the council before, and getting small arms is only really discussed explicitly once every 2 years. So there's another conversations to be had within that space. But yeah, I'd like to thank all the panelists for a really fantastic conversation today. I've been taking notes because despite talking to you all regularly, I'm still learning. So thank you again, and to the participants, I'd encourage you to go read the report because it really adds value and it's going to be of great help in this area. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Emma. And first, in closing, really, I want to start by thanking the participants because their questions and answers really drove this discussion, and credit really goes to them. And thank you so much for all of you to stick around for the full session. We see a lot of people still here, so we are very grateful. Second, I want to thank the panelists. Thank you, Jonah, Rachel, and Nicholas, for this dialogue. It's been a pleasure and an honor for me to join you today. Third, in terms of this partnership, of course, I want to recognize France and Germany for supporting this consortium, which is an important one. And finally, of course, Emma, our gratitude to the support of the government of Ireland for facilitating and enabling this meeting. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. And we hope to be able to join this conversation further. I hope we went over 1 minute, but it is what it is at this point. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the week. All the best now.